Alright, hi guys, so Sid Dragon Creations here, and today we've got a quick tutorial in Blender on how to make segmented horns. So you can use this to create any type of horns you want. If you want a more organic feel compared to just extruding something along a profile for like a smooth type horn. So the way it works is that I'm going to go into it here, but you can use a curve modifier to basically control the position of your horns. So as you can see here, we can demonstrate that we can move, and you'll see the segments will follow it. So this is super versatile, and it's a really handy tool for kind of figuring out kind of different horn positions you want. And especially you can, because the process is automated, it just makes it much easier to kind of conceptualize any kind of designs you might have for the horns. I'm starting with a fresh scene here. You want to delete your default cube, and then what you want to do is you're going to add an empty. I'm going to rename it for the sake of clarity, and I'm going to call it taper control, and you're going to see why that's going to be important in a minute. So, okay, from there, basically what we do is we want to add in a curve. We take our curve, and you want to reorientate it so that the base point of the curve is lined up where the origin of your empty is. Okay, so it doesn't particularly matter in terms of where you put everything, but this will become important for how the modifiers work together with the different curves. So here I'm just kind of moving it. You can put it in any position you want, but for now I'm just going to leave it like this just for the sake of this demonstration. You can add more segments in afterwards, but for now it's just going to stay as is. So then on top of that, what you're going to do is you're basically going to add in your cube. Scale this to whatever size you want, or you can add in a different type of mesh, but for the sake of this, we're just going to keep it with the cube. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to add a fixed count array modifier, and we're going to change the relative offset here so that the cube doesn't get displaced in the x-axis and it gets displaced in the z-axis, so it's kind of closer to the curve, which is where we want it. So then we move down from there and we go to object offset. All right. So what we want to then do is we select our object, and we're going to select the empty that we named taper control earlier. So you'll see now we just have to rescale this cube so that you can actually see the effect of what's happening. And here is we're increasing the number of objects in our array. As you can see, so when we actually select our taper control and we scale that down, you can see that it actually follows along and it starts to decrease the size of each object. And so if you actually modify the relative offset, you can get these segments to be closer to each other. So this actually creates quite a nice effect if you have a different type of mesh with it. So just here, I'm going to smooth it out. You can kind of see what I'm going for here. So again, look, you can take this mesh. Your base mesh will basically be duplicated over and over again. So you can change that to whatever shape you want. So now if I go into modifiers and I select curve, we're going to select the curve that we added earlier. And now you can see that it conforms to the shape of the curve. So this is super useful, especially for if you're trying to get objects to follow a curve, because you can basically increase the count for the array, and it'll keep copying each object along that curve up until the point that it actually runs off the end of it. So you can kind of get around this issue by lengthening the curve, or you can get around the issue by actually scaling down the objects. As you can see here, if you modify the size of that taper control, it will actually shrink everything back down to match the curve. So it just takes a little bit of playing with to kind of get to the shape that you want. And you can see when we actually go in to grab the handles on the curve, you can move these around and rotate them, and as the curve moves, everything else will follow along with it. So that's from earlier, that's how you can create dragon type horns. You can create ram horns. It just depends on kind of how much you want to modify everything. So here we can also add in another segment. So we hit W and we subdivide. So by doing that, we've added another point through which the curve can move. So this is really handy as a spline type tool as well. And there's a whole host of possibilities with this. So the main thing I think is if you go into it here and you select your mesh, and if you want to basically modify the base mesh like we said earlier, you can take that base mesh and make it into whatever shape you want, any kind of orientation. So for here, I'm just going to demonstrate kind of a front and back approach that I would use for the horns. I'll basically drag it along the y-axis, And we can adjust the height of the middle section as well to try and get a little bit more of an overlap. But by doing this, you'll see that this kind of pushes everything else out. So it's important to, again, play with that relative offset in the array modifier to achieve the desired effect. So if I tab back out into object mode, you'll see now with the effect it actually has on the curve itself. So you can see some segments are actually pushed forward and some are pushed backwards. So this is quite nice, and it can be a little bit more organic. If you compare it to how normal kind of goat horns or ram horns look, they're not always perfectly cylindrical, and they generally have a small kind of concave section on the back. Useful because it depends on the type of horns that you want to achieve and the references that you have, so you can just move it to whatever kind of way you want. So quickly demonstrate how you can achieve a ram horn type effect or a kind of alternative curve to a dragon horn. So if you grab your handles and you can rotate them using R or G to grab, and you can keep rotating these and playing around with them. You can also scale the handles to try and smooth out the bend in the curve. So this could be trying to do a 3D model of a goat or do like a skull or something. It just gives you a lot more room to work with, and it saves you having to duplicate the same mesh over and over again if you want to achieve a segmented type style horn. And this is basically what I used this technique for. So for my cosplay of Ranbu from the Dream SMP, what I wanted to achieve here was kind of matching the horns as a prosthetic to my head. So I wasn't planning on installing them on a headband. I just wanted to be able to print them, 3D print them, and actually apply them directly to my head. So you can see here I actually have a head scan. So by importing that, I was basically able to use a Boolean modifier and use the base of the horns to the shape of my head, so that once they were 3D printed, I could apply a layer of liquid latex and then actually use that as a base to adhere them to my head directly to the skin, rather than from the PLA of the horn to my skin, which is probably not safe and I would not recommend. So here's the horn. Kamui Cosplay and Benny have an excellent tutorial on how to export files from Blender for 3D printing. So this is a Prusa slicer because the printer that I have is a Prusa MINI. So what we're looking at here is you can see where the Boolean modifier basically took the curve and the contour of my head and meshed that in to create the effect for the horn, so that it can just mold straight onto my head. So the other side of it as well, and something to be aware of, is that when you're printing the horns and these type of models, the tips get very, very narrow. So what's important to bear in mind is that these may need extra infill. And what infill is for 3D printing is basically how dense the plastic is printed in a certain area. So especially for the tips, I generally add a modifier to it, which increases the amount of infill that I would use. So you can vary this, and sometimes it'll take a little bit of experimenting with it, but the tips will always be one of the weakest points of any of these type of 3D prints. So these are some of my printer settings. So for me, I'm actually using lightweight PLA from ColorFabb. So I had to set up the filament correctly on the printer and do some calibration prints with it. They have a very comprehensive guide on one of the Prusa forums for this, but it'll depend on the printer that you're using. So if we go and we slice the model, now you can see that it has been sliced. So all the supports that are underneath it, it's a little bit of a tricky shape to try and print straight off the print bed because there's no flat sections. So I've deliberately the horn so that it's facing this way, so that as it prints, I know for sure that most of the detail on the top will be captured. Something else to bear in mind is that the direction of your layer lines is quite important. However, that really matters depending on kind of how much time you have to sand and what kind of sanding equipment you have. But for me, because I'm using the lightweight PLA, that's quite easy to sand, and just sand off all the layer lines afterwards. And this is the finished product. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. You can still see some of the layer lines where I got a little bit lazy on the sanding, and you can see the tip has a little bit of damage from where it snapped at one point from dropping it. But other than that, it turned out pretty well. This is the fully painted version. I would definitely recommend as a method of creating horn prosthetics that are super lightweight and super easy to attach, and they retain their strength pretty well even during travel. That is it for this tutorial, so please feel free to ask any further questions in the comment section down below, and I will see you in the next one.